Good afternoon. It is July 9th, 2020. This is Judy Waxman. I am interviewing Judith Winston, and we are doing this over Zoom because we're in the pandemic. So, so happy to see you.
Nice to see
happy
you.
you're doing this. We start right off with, please give me your whole name and when and where you were born.
Okay. My whole name is Judith Ann Mariano Winston, although I only use Judith Ann Winston these days.
Right.
And I was born in Atlantic City, New Jersey in 1943, a place where my mother was born, as well as my brother and sister. Interestingly, it was a long time before I knew anything about women's rights, although in reflecting on my life's journey, I recall there were several instances in which the issues of gender discrimination and race particularly came into my life. My family moved to Philadelphia when I was about 8 or 9. And so I did most of my schooling from 4th grade through high school in Philadelphia. I was a very good student, unlike many of my friends, and it was very obvious as we talked with one another and experienced school, both in elementary school and junior high school, that, you know, I did well. I was doing very well. When I went to junior high school, it was the first time that I had a true experience, I guess, of understanding or having a sense of difference in terms of it was more, I thought at the time, a question of race, but I think it also implicated gender. And the instance was this. I was a big fan of the Perry Mason TV shows, and I thought, yeah, wow, being a lawyer is really just incredible. So I shared that with my 7th grade teacher. I'll never forget it. Her name was Miss Carolyn Long. And when my mother came to the first parent-teachers meeting and met with my teacher, who knew I was a really good student, pulled my mother aside and said, you know, Judy is a really good student, but I really don't think it's realistic for her to think of being for a Negro girl to be a lawyer. And my mother shared that with me. First of all, she was surprised because I don't think I ever said to her I wanted to be a lawyer. And when she repeated that to me, it was just very startling to me. My teacher said to my mother that she thought I would make a really good teacher.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So from that point on, I said, okay, I'm going to be a teacher. All right. So that had been my ambition throughout most of the rest of my education, except in the back of my head, there was always this nagging issue about, you know, why can't I be a lawyer? You know, what's the problem? Anyway, I left junior high school and went to an all-girls high school, public high school. And I think you know many of the people, or at least some of the people who attended the Philadelphia High School for Girls. I know Marcia Greenberger attended girls' high school, and several other people. I came to understand that later. I didn't know that about Marcia until fairly recently, actually. So I went to girls' high school, and it was a wonderful experience in that I felt comfortable in my studies. I had been plagued by this boy in junior high school who was just, I think he liked me, but he was a nuisance, and he was just always bothering me. I'll never forget, his name was Harvey Johnson. I don't know why I would remember that, except it was a very traumatic experience for me to be always bothered by this young man. So when I got to girls' high school, no boys, hooray. I really think it was there that I had a sense of being able to be a leader and to see leaders in school, positions, official positions, running the yearbook and the student council and all of that. And while I was not all that active in those school organizations, it was sort of a revelation. I never really thought deeply about it, Judy, but in retrospect, I think that is where I began to understand the possibilities for me. I was a member of the school orchestra. I played the cello, still play the cello a bit. Some interesting things happened to me. And let me just preface this discussion by saying to you, my orientation was mostly around issues of race, up until I guess I was a year or two out of college. Although again, there were a number of instances that made me quite aware of the fact that as a female, there were some issues that needed to be dealt with. So in girls' high school, again, hearkening back to the issue of my feeling some discomfort around the issue of race, one particular instance that stands out, it was in my senior year of high school. There was an announcement over the loudspeaker or the intercom system that all Negro girls interested in interviewing with the representative from Howard University should go to a particular room at a particular time. And so when that time came, I got up from my seat in my homeroom to go out, and along with one other classmate who was going to that meeting. And my homeroom teacher said to me, "Miss Mariano," which is my maiden name, "Miss Mariano, where are you going?" And she said, "Come here, where are you going?" I said, "I'm going to meet with the Howard University rep." She said, "That is only for Negro girls." And I said, "I am a Negro girl."
Oh my goodness.
But, you know, it was seemed like all this time, she and probably a number of my other teachers, none of whom were Black, mistook me because of my name, probably for Italian. As you know, there were a lot of Italians in South Philadelphia and other places in Philadelphia. And so, you know, that was disturbing, to say the least. I also recognized in high school, I was the only Black girl in our senior play. And they were, I'm sorry, that's not true. I was one of several Black girls in our senior play, but I was the only one invited to a cast party after our performance. And I walked into this party at a classmate's house, a white classmate, and I recognized that all the girls who were in the play, who were there, were white. And I just remember feeling very, very torn about what I should do. Do they not know I'm a Black student? Would it be problematic if they found out? Should I say something, or should I just, go along? And it was just a, real problem. So there was that. Again, my saving grace for me, quite honestly, because I was very conflicted about that. I did not understand why there was any problem whatsoever. I mean, we were not taught in our history classes anything about slavery or race or that sort of thing. I just didn't know. I had no idea. I didn't know about segregation, though I attended segregated schools. All the schools in Atlantic City, except the high school, were segregated. And I went through 4th grade there. And, I just thought that was a natural way of things, right? I'm leading up to the sort of the awakenings around the issue of feminism and gender. But the great awakening for me as a Black American was when I went to Howard University. I received a scholarship. Neither of my parents went to college. My father didn't even finish 6th grade, I don't think. He grew up in Florida. My mother finished high school, and I think she did 1 or 2 years of secretarial school. So I was first generation college, and I was able to go to college because I received a scholarship from Howard University that covered my tuition and my room and board. Otherwise, my family could not have afforded to send me. So I went there, and there I met the indomitable Patricia Roberts Harris, who, who at the time was an associate dean of students. Now, she had been recruited and named as the associate dean of women. She took all of that stationery with that title on it and crossed out women and put students. And she became quite a mentor to me, largely through my husband, who was not then my husband. They were very close. He was a senior at Howard when I was a freshman, and he knew Pat Harris very well. But anyway, so I said, oh, this is great. She did not want to be, she wanted to be associate dean of all students, though she was a mentor to me. And one of the things that she did, and you'll appreciate this because I know you've probably seen it in other interviews, as a dorm, I lived in the dorm, and we women, freshmen in the dorms, had to be in the dorm at 7 p.m.
Right.
every night. Not only that, we could not go off campus until we passed something called the DC quiz. Now, the Howard University campus was about, 4 blocks square or something like that. Right. And so not being able to go off the campus was an issue. This DC quiz, and it's important because Pat Harris did away with this. This was each girl, woman, I guess we were at that point, had to pass this quiz. And the quiz was all about, what trolley car you had to take to get to a department store. You had to name a beauty parlor and the address. You had to be able to recite the streets in succession through the second alphabet. In Washington, D.C., the streets were named in alphabetical order through, and you start with the A's through whatever, and then you had 1-syllable names, and then you had 2-syllable names going through, and you had to recite that, and you could not, and there were a number of other questions like that about getting around in Washington. And when I told Pat Harris about this DC quiz, which she didn't know anything about, it was being run and enforced by the dorm mothers, she was furious because, of course, the men had no restrictions whatsoever. So she was furious, and she put an end to it. So again, I'm saying, okay, we women have these restrictions and the men don't. So, okay, so there was that. I got married after my sophomore year in college. My husband had graduated from Howard University at the end of my freshman year. We became engaged at the end of my freshman year. I can't believe my parents allowed that. Anyway.
I got married at the end of my junior year, so I was not far behind.
So we married in August 1963. I had just finished my sophomore year, and I went back to California with him where he was doing his graduate work, and I worked for a year there in the accounting office at the University of California, Berkeley. And here was my second and substantial introduction to the issue of, women's rights, feminism. That was the year that Betty Friedan, it was 63, 64, something like that, Betty Friedan wrote her book, The Feminine Mystique, which became a big hit among many women. I had not read the book until one of my husband's graduate student friends, who was also married to another graduate student, came over to dinner, and I was a busy housewife and fixed this lovely dinner, and she, Ellen, this woman, said, well, are you going to go back to school? I said, oh yeah, I'm sure I will. I said, but I'm really enjoying, myself being just, working and being able to come home. And she said, well, aren't you afraid of getting housewife's rot? I said, what? A woman who has nothing other than to take care of her family and to keep house and all of that, though I was working. So she told me about the feminine mystique, and I, of course, immediately went out, and not immediately, but I went out and bought the book, and I started reading. I was like, what? All these poor women who are being kept in the house by prisoners by their husbands who don't want them to work. They end up with depressions and all of that. But of course, some years later, I realized that, my situation in my family was not like that at all. My mother always worked.
course.
My grandmother worked.
Of
My
course.
mother was a sewing machine operator, and my grandmother was a maid. And, you know, that was not something that we experienced. And I had never thought about the question of whether or not there was something I couldn't do because I was a woman. Now, I did harken back to my 7th grade teacher, but I thought her concern had more to do with my race, which she knew about, than my being a girl. So that was maybe number 3 or 4.
Right.
I went back. I finished Howard University, and I went. I finished Howard University in 1966. Our first child was born in 1966, a daughter. We have 2 daughters. We went back to Berkeley, where Lisa was born, in Berkeley, California. My husband was finishing up the residency for his PhD. I did not work then. I had been accepted into the graduate program at Berkeley in the history department, which is where my husband was, again, thinking I was going to be a college professor like he aspired to be, and in fact was. But I said, I'm expecting this baby. This was October when she was born, October 66. I'm not going to start. So I deferred for a semester. And by the time the second semester rolled around, I decided I didn't really want to do that. And so I stayed at home with Lisa until we went back to Washington in 68, at which point I started my first job, a position that Pat Harris actually was responsible for my getting, with the President's Commission on the Causes and Prevention of Violence. It was an offshoot of the Kerner Commission report.
Oh.
And President Johnson, who had, by the way, appointed Patricia Roberts Harris as an ambassador to Luxembourg, I think. That was when I think this, and she was on this commission. She was one of the commission members, and she was appalled by the fact that a number of the commissioners and staff had brought relatives onto the staff. And so when I went to her saying I was looking for a position, she said, hold on, and she arranged for me to be a member of the staff. That led me now to the beginnings of my acquaintance with discrimination against women and girls, particularly in education, because the commission job led me the next year to the Council of the Great City Schools, where I worked on their equity issues. And one of their issues, a few years later, revolved around Title IX, which again, I didn't know anything about. Mm-hmm. So I worked there from 69 to 74. So this must have been in 72 that this came up. And, and I was reading with fascination the whole idea that there was, in fact, discrimination against women, girls and women in elementary, secondary schools and colleges. And so, again, but my major focus was on racial discrimination. I was working on school desegregation, providing technical assistance to school districts in the South and in the North that had segregated schools, had segregated schools either by law or de jure. And so that was my focus there. But, again, I also helping to provide technical assistance on what school districts needed to do to make sure that they were providing gender equity to the girls enrolled in their schools.
So how'd you get to law school?
Well, I got to law school this way. I was providing testimony in some of these school desegregation cases on the rationale for school desegregation and some of the methodologies for desegregating schools. And I was talking to school superintendents and board members, most of them having higher degrees, and I was feeling very uncomfortable about the fact that I had only a BA degree. I didn't have any, I never had classes in education or anything else. I just, learned through research how to deal with some of these issues. I knew I didn't want to go to graduate school. My husband was still working on his PhD dissertation. I said I do not want to spend 7 years in graduate school. So I decided again, hey, we had a couple of friends who were lawyers. I'd done some work for the Legal Defense Fund when I was in college, helping them locate files on various cases. So I knew about lawyering. So I decided to go to law school to get this law degree with the expectation I would come back to the job that I had at the Council of Great City Schools. I had become the director of their equity program, and I was really enjoying it. So I went to law school and discovered that I had not only this great interest in civil rights in the educational setting, but also in what the law could do. And so it was at that point, Judy, that I worked part-time while in law school. I was a full-time law student, but I worked part-time with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. And I worked with Norman Chachkin, who had been at the Legal Defense Fund. I'd met him at the Legal Defense Fund. He'd come to Washington. Also Cindy Brown. Norman and Cindy Brown were co-directors of something called the Federal Education Project, which I worked on. And one of the things that they were looking at was women and girls and students of color in vocational education programs. They and Phyllis McClure, who was at the Legal Defense Fund, directed me to the Center for Social Law and Social Policy, where I met, I'm pretty sure I met, so my memory is a little bit foggy in this, I met Marcia Greenberger. I was getting some help on how to go through the legislative history of the Vocational Education Act. And again, here's, my introduction to the fact that, girls were steered into vocational education courses that were women-centered, and so there was that aspect of my education. Really, when I left law school in 77, I was in law school 74 to 77. Both of our daughters had been born by that time. One was 3 and one was 7 when I started law school, and so I had this responsibility with my husband running a household, and I was running it, and getting my law degree and taking care of these 2 little girls. And I think that's when I became really keenly aware of my feminist instincts, if not my knowledge, because I'm saying I'm doing all of this. And I was so concerned I wasn't doing any of it very well. It's like, you know this issue. I think most of us who are feminists, come early or late feminists, recognize this. And so, my vocational, my professional work as a lawyer included looking at policy and legal issues related to race and gender discrimination in education. When I left law school, I went to work for David Tatel, who had been named the director of the Office for Civil Rights at the then Department of Health, Education, and Welfare. I worked most directly with Norman Chachkin, at least for the first 6 months. Norman, in fact, had invited me to come. He was a deputy director. After I'd been there for about a month, Norman said he was leaving because he couldn't stand the way government operated. They had these layers of sign-offs and all of that. Anyway, when Norman left, I was directly assigned to David as his special assistant. At that time, one of the several of the big issues included the desegregation of higher education. There was also a lawsuit that had been ongoing for some time about challenging the department's enforcement of both Title VI. That was the Adams lawsuit. And then another that had been brought by on behalf of the Women's Educational Action League, I think, or Equity Act.
WEAL, yeah.
WEAL, WEAL. And Marcia Greenberger was one of the chief litigators on behalf of the plaintiffs in that case. And so there was a lot of interaction that I had with David and others in OCR, with Marcia, and with Norman Chachkin, who had gone back to the Legal Defense Fund, and other lawyers whose names are well known within the civil rights community, who were at that time and today as well. Judy Lichtman. You know, and I was, again, really learning about the many ways in which we women and girls at that time experienced discrimination. The extent to which our careers were blocked by men in power who thought we had no place in the law or many other places outside of the home. That was a great experience for me. I subsequently went to work for Eleanor Holmes Norton at the EEOC to learn something about something about Title VII and the way in which discrimination on the basis of race and gender manifested itself in employment. Okay, so there was that. I worked on affirmative action issues with, when I worked for Eleanor as her executive assistant and legal counsel. Mostly it was work on policy, although there were some litigation issues that I had some input on. I'm not a litigator, I've never been a litigator, but I have worked on briefs at the appellate level as amicus in a number of the positions that I held. You know, Judy, I have to stop and just take a breath and say to you, and when I started thinking about these questions and reviewing my life, I was saying, wow, I've done a lot of stuff. I'm 76 years old, and so I have to apologize for taking so long to get to today, if we ever get there.
No, this is fabulous. This is what we want. So I do need to ask you, like, is there any, like, one policy effort that you worked on that particularly stands out during that time?
Yes, I'm thinking about, you know, my so-called accomplishments. Let me just say, first of all, I think my accomplishments, was just my progression of positions working on these issues, and I was laser focused on race and gender discrimination. But the affirmative action wars were, I think my work in that area, I found the most gratifying, and I think perhaps my biggest accomplishment, not that I did anything by myself, but I did when I went to the U.S. Department of Education as general counsel in 1993 in the Clinton administration. Affirmative action litigation was burning hot then, and the Department of Education had to issue guidance on affirmative action. I worked very, very closely with the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights and members of my staff and her staff on coming up with guidance on affirmative action for colleges and universities. You know, that subsequently became that, and the issue itself became the subject of two very important Supreme Court cases out of Michigan, University of Michigan. And so, and I thought I made a real contribution. We worked in coalition with a number of organizations, and I spent some time working with the University of Michigan folks. Marvin Krisloff was the general counsel of the University of Michigan. He had worked at the Justice Department, the Office for Civil Rights, when I worked with him. And so that became an opportunity for us to consult with many other people. Again, I want to be careful about not taking credit where credit is not due. That's what I would describe as my greatest professional, the thing that I remember most in my profession, being most satisfying and most important worked with John Payton, who litigated one of those cases. That was an extraordinary opportunity. Subsequently, went to Chile and Brazil to talk about affirmative action in the United States in both places. This is something that was being considered mostly in Brazil. And I went with John Payton, and I went and also with Ted Shaw, who was at the Legal Defense Fund at that time. And again, my experience as general counsel really made that possible, to have those international experiences. And so it was a very fulfilling time for me all the way through. I have to say that my most important accomplishment in my personal life are my two daughters, who are just extraordinary women. Lisa, who used to read my case books to me when I was a first-year law student, because I was so nervous about being back in school. It's been 8 years since I graduated from college before I went to law school. And I tell everyone that she read torts my first year and commercial law my second. But she was a wonderful reader at 7 and 8, and she'd ask these wonderful questions that I could not answer as a law student. And so, but Lisa went on, she said that was the beginning of her deep interest in becoming a lawyer. And she went to Stanford University as an undergraduate, excelled, was elected Phi Beta Kappa and had all kinds of honors, and then went to the Harvard Law School, where she excelled and graduated with honors. And she, in addition to practicing as a labor and employment lawyer, working on employment discrimination cases, she became a partner in a Dallas law firm. And then she's recently retired, if you can believe it or not, but she became the executive vice president and general counsel of a transportation company in Dallas, with offices really around the world, but also the country. They providing paralegal, paratransit opportunities. So she was general counsel, and she subsequently was also corporate secretary. She's retired and is now chairman of that board, chairperson, I guess, or chair of the board of this transportation company. She says she's retired, but I think she's working as hard as as this chairperson, but as she did when she was working full time. My other daughter, again, I feel it's very important to talk about them as people I'm very proud of. I can't take all the credit. My husband has to take much of the credit for the way they turned out. Our youngest daughter is a professor of psychology at Howard University. She went to Howard as an undergraduate, PhD from University of Michigan, but she works on issues of identity among women and women of color in academia. She has really been helping lots of women through her research and business that she has, and helping them to create their own narrative, not to be defined by someone else, to understand, their own capabilities. And so she started out, again, I'm going to get back to me, but I just want to say that she started out trying to help people understand why Black students, Black professionals, women achieve success. Why are they successful? A lot of people are talking about failure, particularly among Black students, why they fail and all of the barriers that they face. She said, how did these people who are now scientists, mathematicians, overcome all of that? So that's what she started out doing, and now she's applying that in the context of women academicians, for the most part, and women of color who are in the professoriate. So
wow,
she's fine. So
That's,
anyway, so
their
that's,
accomplishments for sure.
yeah, and yeah, as I said, I'm very proud of what they do, and we've had a number of conversations. I've been on panels with both of them, not the same panel, in which we shared our sense of how we have managed to become successful as women, as lawyers, in the case of my oldest daughter, in a man's world, which it was largely then. And I was with and my youngest daughter, and this is important, I think, for this discussion. My youngest daughter and I were on a panel to talk about how we were influenced by each other in our professional choices. And we were told not to talk to one another before the panel and before it's saying what we were going to say. We're not to talk about that. And what my youngest daughter said at that panel, which was over maybe 2 decades ago, is that she and her sister never thought that they could be successful professional women. And she said the reason was she said, my mother did everything. And we just felt we couldn't live up to that. She said she would, and this is true, I would, cooking dinners, planning menus, working as a professional. I made their prom dresses, so she went on and on about this. In my eyes, she said, so we never thought we could ever be successful because we couldn't do that. She was saying I was some sort of superwoman. And then I spoke. I said, I am just floored by that because I was doing all that. I said I was exhausted most of the time. I felt I wasn't doing any of it well. Mm-hmm. And I was waiting for the big failure. I was sort of winging it both at home and in the office, feeling I didn't read enough. I didn't. And it was such an eye-opener, so, wow. How did that happen? I was trying to be the role model, but the role model was just too big, they felt, for them to live up to. I've counseled my daughters as young women, and I've counseled a number of women mentees. People come to me and say, well, how did you do it? How do I get into law and all of this sort of thing? And, how do I manage? They talk about some of the experiences that they faced as women trying to make it through. And I said, I learned something through difficult experience about how to present oneself. Not only, I said, we women think that it's important to just get the substance of our profession, the law down, we know it back and forward, we were ready. I said, and while that may be important, really, in my view, the most important thing for me was learning how to act like a white lawyer who is male. I said, so just imagine yourself in your horn rim glasses, tie. I said, I've never been in any meeting of more than 2 or 3 people or had any speaking engagement where I didn't have great butterflies in my stomach. I said, and it's still true. Mm-hmm. I said, what I recommend you do is, first of all, you don't apologize. I'm sorry, I should have read all of this, but I didn't get a chance to do this. Right. Every sentence, every statement would be prefaced by an apology. So by that time, nobody's paying attention to you. I said, I learned that because my father-in-law used to call me Miss Pardon Me, because everything I started was with an apology. I said, so you don't do that. I said, and when you're presenting yourself and you haven't read as much as you would have liked to, that's fine. That's all right. Just you take those butterflies, imagine that there's a paddle in your stomach. And as you're speaking, the paddle is slowly, slowly crushing those poor butterflies. And what happens is your voice becomes steadier and you begin to speak with great authority, even if you don't believe you have it. I said, and what you will probably find is that you know more than anybody in that audience.
And on the panel even.
Exactly. You know, I learned when I was teaching law school some years later. I was at the Washington College of Law, American University, and you know, I was advised by one of my colleagues there, a woman who was also something of a mentor to me there, said, don't ever say you don't know anything. Just don't do that. And so what I would do, both professionally and when I was teaching, if somebody asked me a question I didn't know an answer to, I would say, that's a really good question. What do you think? I would do that in meetings with lawyers when I was general counsel. There was a lot of skepticism about my general counsel position by many of the young men lawyers there. There had been other women general counsel, but never a Black woman general counsel. And, you know, many of them had all of the superstitions that people tend to have about women of color and men of color in their professions. You know, I had law students in my class, young men in my class, questioning my my knowledge. I had once, you know, we had our exams were evaluated by our students, and there were a couple of, I'm sure there was some consultation, a couple of students who said they resented the fact that I was teaching civil procedure from the perspective of a Black woman. Right? Yes, that's real. And I was,
oh my
whose
gosh.
perspective was I supposed to have? The other interesting thing that happened in law school was that students were complaining about, some students, two or three students complaining about the fact that I had introduced race into my fact patterns on these law school exams. Okay, so I had one fact pattern in a question about class action that involved a class of African Americans who were protesting police brutality or alleging police brutality. And so the question is, you know, what constitutes the class? What are the elements of the class? And students said I had introduced race, and it gave some students an unfair advantage. So if you're talking about a class action lawsuit that involves African Americans and you're an African American, then you must know something that we don't. It was just astounding. But again, these are
you were ahead of your time. That's what I have to
I was. I left when I went to law school. I went to HEW, then I went to the EEOC, and from there I was invited to become a career lawyer at the newly established Department of Education. So I was there from 80 to 86 as an assistant general counsel, again working on issues, affirmative action issues of race, advising the secretary on legal matters that came up to him on those issues. I left the department in 86. I loved my job. I mean, I had a wonderful staff of lawyers working with me. I loved my job, but it was during the Reagan administration, which was really very, very hostile to civil rights. And so I felt like that the defendants in this litigation or these policies were I felt like we were defendants having to justify the policies that we had established. So I left. My husband said to me, he said, Judy, you know, we don't have a dog you can kick around when you come home from the office, just frustrated with what's going on at the department. It was quite awful, actually. Not unlike some of the things that are happening today in these federal offices. And so he said, you either need to find a new husband or find a new job. So I decided to find a new job. And I went to the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights as the deputy director. I left there to go to the Women's Legal Defense Fund as a deputy director for policy, where I worked on a number of issues, including the Family Medical Leave Act, which Donna Lenhoff really was the lead on, but I did work on that and worked in coalitions with the members of the Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. And it was after the Women's Legal Defense Fund, Judy, that I went to teach at American university's Washington College of Law until I was confirmed by the Senate to be the general counsel of the U.S. Department of Education during the Bill Clinton administration. I served in that position from 1993 to the end of the Clinton administration, 2001. I also took on the position of undersecretary. So I was undersecretary and general counsel during the last few years of the Clinton administration. And in between 93, 2001, the president asked me to please come to the White House and be the executive director of his race initiative. Mm-hmm. And that was a job that almost killed me. I mean, I was just not prepared for all that was involved in trying to talk about race and change policies across the government that we felt were discriminatory, and caused a number of disparities on the basis of race. And when I finally left the Clinton administration in 2001, I went back to teaching for a year as a research professor of law at American University, where I intended to stay for a while, but I realized that I missed talking to adults. And law students tend to be very needy. And, I did it, but I had the good fortune of receiving a call from a fellow who was the general counsel of the Los Angeles Unified School District, asking me if I would be interested, I guess, to be the Washington counsel for the Los Angeles Unified School District. Oh. And that led to a decision for me to open a law firm where I could do this work with my former colleague, Claudia Withers, who, by the way, is a wonderful feminist too, opened Winston, Withers and Associates, a law firm. She worked on employment discrimination matters, Title VII, and I worked on school matters. I also, in addition to representing Los Angeles Unified School District, I did some work for MIT and the University of Oregon Health Sciences University on affirmative action measures. And there's one other, and Wesleyan.
And are these affirmative actions both race and gender?
Yes, yes. So at that point, this is 2003 to 2007, I had the law firm. There was some concern about how to implement the Supreme Court decisions, the Grutter decision, and can't remember the other one. But in any event, it was, though, as you know, affirmative action based on gender is not something that has been nearly as controversial or as the in terms of higher education, I should say, right, as race. But I did work on that, and I did a lot of, I worked with the Women's Legal Defense Fund even before I became a staff member, volunteering to work on their screening committee on litigation matters, what litigation they should be taking on and recommending to law firms. I did a lot of, I should say, extracurricular, volunteer work around issues of gender. And as I've mentioned, in terms of my accomplishments, I feel as though my professional life was really happily focused on the things that I cared most about. And I felt like I was making a contribution, whether it was a volunteer effort or whether I was being paid as a lawyer to do these things. Race and gender discrimination, disparities that exist for women and people of color in all aspects of our life in America. So anyway, that's that's my story.
And
I really appreciate you conducting this interview. It's been fun to recall all of these things, and enlightening too, because
right.
every once in a while, you know, I'm retired now, retired when I closed my office in 2007. That was the year our first grandchild was born. They lived in Dallas. I didn't want any clients interfering with my ability to go to Dallas anytime that I wanted. And so, but from time to time, Judy, as particularly during this pandemic, I'm thinking, you know, like, you know, I have nothing to do. You know, what does this all mean? I mean, here I am. I don't remember half of the things that I once knew that were important in my teaching and my practice. And so I will just say that what has been quite healthy for me is to go through my resume as I was anticipating this discussion and realizing, yes, I've had quite a full, rewarding life as a lawyer and as a woman